Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. This is our second quarter meeting for Bronzeville SMART, which is a quarterly series that is supporting our efforts to see Bronzeville become not only an international heritage tourism destination, which you've heard us say for years. We're celebrating 30 years of that effort this year in 2019. But as we move into our next century, our focus is to really develop Bronzeville as a smart tech innovation district. And so we've been doing a series of meetups to, one, inform this process and also engage more of the community in what does it really take. So today, our quarterly series is a part of the Chicago Community Trust annual event called On the Table. So what we're putting on the table today is green jobs. And green jobs are really on the table. And so what we recognize is that that is happening from a policy position that has been occurring. And we have some greetings from our congressman, Congressman Rush, who could not be here with us today, but happens to be the co-chair for the Congressional Committee on Energy. And so today, he sent us greetings. We have a copy of the legislation on the wall, but you can look for this. This is House Bill 1315, and it is in hearings as we speak. I had an opportunity to watch some of it yesterday, or last week, and they refer to this as from blue collar to green collar. So what we're talking about is happening in session, focusing on how is this going to translate into underserved markets. And so we want to be very ready. We want to be ready in terms of training, enterprise, and having a sustainable pipeline that we fill. So this community knows that this is more than viable for us. Not only are we the home of the nation's first clustered microgrid, but we've had the opportunity with our partner IIT of having a microgrid in this community all along. And so now we're demonstrating for the nation what this would mean to have two that could cluster and work together. The developers that we've been meeting with in our past sessions have been focusing with us on not only Bronzeville Community of the Future, but how do we develop this infrastructure? And so part of this infrastructure is really the ability to have this human capital. The human capital is really a part of what makes this sustainable. This is what, when we talk about the pipeline, today's session and what we really want to do is make this as conversational as possible, is to figure out how do we move from policy to practice. And so we're excited because two of our community partners, the Center for Neighborhood Technology, as well as Blacks in Green, were a part of the governor's transition team on Powering Illinois. And those documents are also online where they are translating this, again, from policy to practice. So having that representation has been wonderful in terms of focusing on our objectives. With our recent mayor-elect, Lori Lightfoot, we also have a green, environmental, sustainable task force as well. And we have a representative today, Anton Seals, who also represented that community interest on what does this mean for green jobs, smart, all of that. So today has really been developed for us to try to translate this, to again see ourselves as ambassadors. We are fortunate to have two people who were formerly the head of the Department of the Environment for the city. Those are now positions where we are going to see what happens moving forward, but we've got folks who we can ask questions literally off the table. So we've got an advantage. And then the other part of this is Not only are we here being hosted at IBEW local number 134, the absolute best one, not only are we here being supported with their effort, but we have someone who's going to, Harry Odie, who's going to tell us even more about what's going on as it relates to apprenticeships and this pipeline and training that we're talking about. We've been hearing a lot about it. We talked a little bit about solar training, but we're going to talk even more about these level of apprenticeship. And then the translation of a lot of this is, what does this mean for us as a consumer? We got Cub here to really talk about what does this mean in terms of us as taxpayers, homeowners, recognizing that we're going to be a part of this industry. So this is a very diverse panel. It was selected so that we can have a cross-section of conversation on the table. The effort that we're going to have for working lunch, these folks will please get your questions. A couple of them have to leave at 12. But then we're going to turn the tables, and these 4 tables, we're going to be on the table putting our thoughts together for what our memo to the mayor should say as it relates to green jobs. So that's what the Chicago Community Trust has charged us with today as a host for On the Table, is translating that memo to the mayor as it relates to what does this mean for our community, what is our vision, and what do we think we need. I know I need to ask a lot more questions about what is it that we need to do this beside the STEM education training, solar training. What else can we do as a community? And we obviously, as a community development corporation, I asked Bill to be our, Bill Abolt. I asked Bill to be not only our presenter, he is the Vice President for Energy at AECOM, and we've been working with him on a number of development projects where, you know, developers are not required to put in this smart infrastructure, but again, our focus is being Bronzeville smart, and that means planning for the future. So Bill will be doing kind of 2 hats in terms of helping to translate infrastructure, developers, working with utilities, but I think we have enough of a range to get all our questions answered today. So Bill, we're going to put it on the table and start with you.
So my name is Bill Abolt. I'm with a company called AECOM. AECOM is a big planning, design, and engineering company that focuses on the transformation of cities here in the Midwest and places like Chicago, but really across the globe. And we're focused on our belief that the future is being defined in the great cities like Chicago, and that part of that is to create a future that is healthier, cleaner, and more vibrant, and more equitable. I was really excited that Paula asked me to come down and help to moderate this panel, as well as facilitate some of the discussions this afternoon over lunch. We have the good fortune of being able to work with Paula and the community on behalf of ComEd through the work that it's doing here in Bronzeville around the community of the future. Their effort in collaboration with the community to make Bronzeville the cleanest, or the greenest, most resilient, and most connected neighborhood in the United States. And just from the analysis that we have done around the country, Bronzeville is well on its way to being that. There are very few examples. In fact, we couldn't count them on our hand, or we could count them on our one hand and still have lots of fingers left, of a utility working in close collaboration with the community, engaging with the city of Chicago to focus on an existing community and the types of investments that achieve the types of really broad goals that Paula laid out. There are very few places in the United States where this much innovation and excitement is happening. And it's not just about energy, which is ComEd's core business. It's about mobility and getting people around. It's about public health. It's about affordability, and it's about job creation. In that transformation of the energy system, in the transformation of infrastructure like transportation, in the discussions we're having on the water system in the city of Chicago, there are some significant challenges that we have to address. Challenges of pollution from current means of generating energy, challenges of congestion associated with mobility options, challenges of affordability and public health around things like our water system. But in meeting those challenges, there are some dramatic opportunities, opportunities for advancing education and training, opportunities for jobs, and opportunities for building really healthy, vibrant, and connected communities. Again, that's, I think, what the work that Paula and you and ComEd and others have been doing in Bronzeville, and I think this is probably one of the first places in the country where you will see direct, measurable results of collaboration in action. So Paula had asked to help put together a panel that focused on what are the opportunities, particularly around green jobs. What is a green job? What does it mean? How do we get them? And I think, as importantly, how do we prepare communities for the opportunities that exist? And I think what we see around the country, and we do this type of planning work both here in Chicago but elsewhere around the U.S., is a significant decentralization of the way that we manage energy, as an example, or democratization of the way we get around, or that we manage things like basement flooding. Those require solutions that are more distributed or decentralized. They're solutions that actively engage residents at home and at work in implementing those strategies, from changing out energy efficient light bulbs to disconnecting your downspout in your backyard. And with that engagement with the community also comes significant new opportunities around job training, from managing energy of buildings to creating green infrastructure that manages stuff that used to go into a sewer and into a central facility. And we've put together a panel today that I think can address each one of those areas of job training and opportunity, as well as giving you a broader kind of policy context of how things are changing and what that means for you here in Bronzeville, as well as what it means for the city of Chicago and our economy. We'll just start to my left. At the far end is Harry Odie from IBEW. When I worked at the city of Chicago, one of my first opportunities to work on green jobs related to energy was in cooperation with IBEW around a large purchase of solar energy. The city has come a long way in what it's doing around renewable energy, and it could not have gotten there without the incredible investments, commitment, and efforts of IBEW. Sarah Moskowitz, who's the Managing Director of Outreach at the Citizens Utility Board. CUB has spent a good deal of time in helping to ensure, working closely with the utilities, other stakeholders, policymakers, to make sure that things like the Future Energy Jobs Act, that is a really dramatic transformation of where the state is going, how those things benefit all of the participants and create affordable, clean energy options for communities. Karen Weigert is a Vice President of Business and Strategy for an organization called Slipstream. Slipstream is probably one of the better examples that we have, concrete examples of green jobs. As Paula mentioned previously, she had served as Chief Sustainability Officer at the City of Chicago, but Slipstream specializes in energy policies and then the implementation of those policies to make communities more energy efficient. From hiring people to engaging with the community to get public engagement and activity. She's also leading a Chicago Community Trust funded program that is focusing specifically on Bronzeville around something that's a title called Jumpstarting the Low Carbon Economy, trying to figure out how things like the Future Energy Jobs Act, how investments like the ones ComEd is making, not just in energy efficiency but the microgrid, how those create opportunities within communities. And then finally, to kick us off, Anton Seals is the co-chair of Mayor-elect Lightfoot's environmental transition team. I think the mayor-elect has pretty much set out one of the more ambitious transition efforts in the level of public engagement and transparency around the engagement, how you submit ideas, what you pull together. And one of her key priorities is the environment and what perhaps a newly constituted Department of Environment might look like, what that means for equity in the economy and public health. And so we thought we would start the discussion with Anton, giving you a sense of what both his day job, but also his charge by the mayor-elect for him and the other co-chairs, what they intend to deliver. I think it's due, right, in the next few days? Yeah. Good, outstanding. You heard it here first. Thanks, Anton.
Thanks, Bill. Good morning, everybody. So I'm not going to go into exact detail, but I can kind of lift up some of the really big parts of the values that we've been working towards to include in this environmental transition report, and then also kind of laying a framework around how we think the city should be pursuing the environment work that needs to happen, in particular addressing climate change. And then we can kind of dive into green jobs. I know that's an old new buzzword that goes back a little bit. But just stepping back a second, again, I'm Anton Seals Jr. I'm the lead steward of Grow Greater Inglewood. Grow Greater Inglewood started as a coalition co-convened by myself and now State Representative Sonia Harper, in particular focused on making sure that black farmers were getting access to city-owned land in a pretty much black community. And, really addressing that connectivity around the economic opportunities in the food system. And then also thinking about what also then expanded from that is kind of leading the stewardship around the environmental kind of stewardship that needs to happen in communities like Inglewood that have been so divested in the last, I don't know, a lot of years. And I think that one of the things that has happened over the years is, how do you give voice to and make sure that you're advocating for those who usually are not at tables, and to speak really clearly and definitively with conviction around, what and how we're defining equity, because that means something to different folks depending on where their base is, in particular around racial equity in a city like Chicago that is racially divided, and that still needs to get some healing. And so all of that, of course, is related to the environment, because you can't skip to the healing fuzzy part without holding some hard truths and acknowledging some hard truths. And I think that's going to be the work forthcoming is, some of these hard truths. So some of the stuff that we've kind of really focused on the environmental transition team has been really focused on land, water, air, and energy in particular. The lens in which we are trying to uplift the new mayor-elect's values, which are transparency, accountability, equity, diversity, and inclusivity, is through the environmental justice framework, right? And so if you do not know what the environmental justice framework is, you should probably just take some time to Google. There are like 17 values, but a lot of that gets at the core of like, what does equity really look like in terms of like, how does the government distribute its resources, and how do you address climate change? So one of the big things that we learned in this group that was pulled together by the mayor-elect is that, one is that I think that there are two different conversations that are happening around climate change. One in circles where there are solutions that are being meted out, but aren't connecting to the people who are most vulnerable to climate change, right? And so how do we then configure that? So an example is like water in the city. And then what's the role that the city can then play in addressing some of those issues? When the current mayor, I think he has 5 more days, when he took office, he disbanded the Department of Environment, but the work did not stop. It just ended up in different parts of the Department of Planning. F2M took on some of the work, and I'm sure the folks who actually used to do the day-to-day work can speak better to that than I can. So one of the charges is to really figure out, how do we drive home what the city can provide in terms of like making equitable resources available, and how do you build up, in particular, wealth in these communities around what the sector is. One of the other things that we're challenged with is that you're holding two kind of ideas that are somewhat opposed around in the environment and its natural state, and the conservation and stewardship of the land, also then being met with the kind of demands of capital and a capital market to make money. And those things are, and some of the solutions in terms of resiliency come out of that framework, kind of trying to mesh the two around that we can be, good stewards, but also still make money, right? And we're not quite sure how well that looks if that is not spread across, to multiple audiences, which right now it is not. So a lot of these spaces usually are not as diverse as they could be in terms of thought, in terms of the kind of solutions that could be community-led and driven, as opposed to the framework we're currently used to, is like you have someone who brings in the expertise and resolves it, and you play the sub. Well, that doesn't really get at the heart of particular African-American issues that we're dealing with on the south and west sides of Chicago. And so all of that is kind of coming out in some of this kind of environmental justice. So the big part would be like, okay, so how do we then do that?
I was about to ask you, what are some of the ideas that are emerging that actually make sure that addressing something like climate, which is a global problem, can actually have a measurable impact in a neighborhood?
Yeah, so one of the big things that we think that could be done right away is raising the level of awareness and kind of making sure that we're having more communication around what climate change means, what all these terms mean when we're talking about green jobs, climate change. People don't, it's not clear. Right. And it's not clear in terms of then who's delivering those services either. And what role does the citizen play in also, as a good steward of being in a city, what role can they also play? So thinking about a much more educational approach that we can get more people engaged in what it means to address climate change issues has been one of the big ones. But when you say climate change, you're talking about not only the land, you're talking about the air, you're talking about water, you're talking about energy. So it's a tremendous big sector, and it cuts across all these different lines. And so one of the other things that's come up is that in terms of the city to be able to respond quicker, that there needs to be kind of an office, or not even just the Office of Environment, but a lot of the big problems that we're dealing with in terms of how the city can respond is that you need some kind of expediter, because there's so many different departments that kind of slow down the process, and they're not always all talking to each other, right? And then if they're not talking to each other, then how they're talking with community is completely ajar as well. So some communities are much more engaged around what climate change issues are, and some are completely just on the end of what that means. So those are some of the big kind of highlights that we're sure.
So you talked about your day job,
yeah.
Focusing on urban agriculture and making sure that people get jobs in the food system, which is a pretty massive system. I think that's a great example of how you connect things like health and economic development issues to job opportunities. Do you see in that example, models that you think would work for a new administration in terms of issues like climate? And
sure,
can you maybe tease out a couple that we might see in the transition report? Maybe you can't say that. But
I won't say that yet, because we can't see it. I want them to be able to say what those things are. But, and especially for the incoming mayor to be able to speak for herself around some of the things that we're recommending. But I do think that in terms of the city, as we well know, has got some financial issues. Right. So some of the stuff that we're talking about in terms of where there could be public investment being made, how that's being made is very critical. So I think that's something that's going to continue to have to be teased out. Yeah. In particular, when you think about the environment, most people associated, when you just say the Department of Environment, it's kind of those are the green people. That's nice. It's off to the side, right? And not really. It's a niche kind of. And what I'm now speaking about is in broad terms. For the broader public, when they hear the Department of Environment, it doesn't really connect to their day-to-day in a way that could be really real. And that's the big thing that we have to change. Right. I think in terms of the business class and the way that the resiliency framework has worked, has talked to a certain group of people in order to, like, what they can do and how much money it would take in order to make these kind of solutions work. So what we're searching for, I think, is not so in the urban food system. It's also very much needed in terms of, like, what is community controlled land. So on the south and west side is where you have most of your vacant city land.
Right.
So part of this, solutions is not to turn it over to other groups who can come in and do the work. It's the people who are already on the ground who are trying to gain capacity that need support in order to grow, right? And so we could partner with other groups, right, no problem. But what we can't continue to have is a big behemoth come in, and when I'm saying that is groups that are well resourced or financed, that are leading the work in communities where they are not part of. And that creates a tension. Mm-hmm. And so it's acknowledging that by that creating a tension, you're not really resolving the issue. What, right, you're doing is perpetuating a system that doesn't allow for multiple voices to really be not even just heard, but also lifted up and put forward in terms of the leadership of what happens in those spaces. So that then translates into people not really engaging well, right, because they don't think it's really for them at all. Actually,
urban ag, and the reason I asked it, because urban ag is a great example of a systems approach to a complex challenge that is creating health and economic opportunity and building a better system with the same amount of dollars and creating more value. And
well, I mean, so here's a great example, yeah, around, urban ag. Farming is, across the sector itself, is a very tough business financially. Whether, if I go downstate and talk to some of our rural partners who are in southern Illinois, they are experiencing some of the same challenges we are in the urban settings. They have much more scale and much more land, but in terms of doing this work for a living is very difficult in urban spaces. Right. But where you do find in the food system where there are opportunities is farmers then creating value-added products that then can be then lifted up. And what you need in order for that then gets into this conversation of a lot of black entrepreneurs. Their big problem is access to capital. Right? So I'm not going to do a thesis here, but the access to capital is a tremendous barrier for black businesses across the board. So if you're talking about a niche market that has very limited participation from certain groups and not getting the funding that they need in order to even compete, then that's where you then have the government to say, well, what can they be doing to help drive this? And thinking out of the box and being proactive around that. That takes a different kind of, leadership, I think, in order to say, what the outcome should be is this, right? So I think that's what we're challenged with. I think, and that's where we're trying to do the work around connecting the food system. Right. It's not just people who are doing gardens, but there's actually, opportunities for it to grow into, this kind of value-added product market. There's also the kind of co-packing, the storage area. But then the other part of it is because of climate change, localizing food becomes very much more attractive because then you're able to control what's going in your food. Right now, we have no clue because of the kind of system that we've created that just kind of acts as a manufacturer. And so we're susceptible to so many different things because of convenience. Right. And that's what's driving it in our system is I'm able to get what I want when I want it. But is it healthy for us? Does it sustain us? So it's really thinking about these things in a different way that I think is going to be the most challenging part for not only, this new administration coming in, but us as Chicagoans as well. And then to define ourselves as Chicagoans. I think that in itself is part of undergirding all of this. Because right now we see ourselves as black Chicago and there's white Chicago and then there's the Latino Chicago. But there isn't really, we say one Chicago, but that's not how it feels and operates in the city. And we don't have data that could back that up either.
Yeah. The data suggests otherwise.
This data definitely suggests otherwise.
I think that, again, let's build on this and move on to the other speakers on this kind of system change. And probably one of the places where there's been the most significant transformation and disruption in terms of our core systems has been around the energy system, particularly with everything from the smart meter legislation to energy efficiency to Future Energy Jobs Act. And I think we can have a good conversation with the next three speakers about how that transition has happened, what are the big policy issues, how have consumers been protected, and then ultimately what are the jobs that have flowed out of it. So we're gonna actually go from Karen down at the end to Harry. I want to talk about that transition as a case study, because I think that's probably the transition that is most evident here in Bronzeville with the partnership with the utility and the community. So Karen, take it away.
No, thank you. It's a pleasure to join you all today. Thank you, Paula, for the invitation, and Bill for moderating our wonderful panel. And as Bill said, I work at a place called Slipstream, which is a nonprofit that's focused on buildings really as the anchor to an equitable, low-carbon economy and place to live. And so the group does everything from research all the way through program design and program delivery. But what that really means is it's jobs and the actual work that is about reducing carbon. And when you're reducing carbon, you're also reducing the other kinds of pollutants that impact our air quality. And so it was interesting, Anton, to think about these broader questions of climate change as an anchor topic. And we're all contributing to it in some ways and living with it in others, and yet people don't always know that. That's right. And so as weather patterns become more extreme, that is most likely climate change coming home to roost for all of us. And so it's a really interesting question. And so when you take that step back, it's been a big driver, I think, for a lot of the policy. And then ultimately it'll end up being a driver both for disruptions that people may face, but also, if we get this right, for opportunities that people can grasp. And that's, I think, the most exciting part of all of this. And so when I take that step back and I look at the city, and as was mentioned earlier, I was lucky enough to serve as the Chief Sustainability Officer for Chicago for about 5 years. The city as a group, all of us together, the largest source of carbon emissions from all of us is actually buildings. And so when we think about the contributions that we are making inadvertently, in a sense, to the broader issues of climate, it's putting carbon in the air that then disrupts so many things. And that carbon, the number one source for us is buildings. And then the annoying part is we spend all of our time indoors. We're always in buildings. I think the stat is we spend 90% of our time indoors, and here we are indoors. So it's buildings. And then the second source of carbon emissions, again, that's contributing to the climate challenge is actually transportation. And so that's how we move essentially between our buildings or between our places. And so if you look at a city largely, or if you look at a community more locally, that's the physical infrastructure that you tend to see. You see the roads and you see the buildings. And then the most important infrastructure is actually the people. And so that's the stories that we can tell and the work that we can create and the pathways that we can generate together going forward. So as we think about climate, that's the contribution. Then the dangers that we face are these weather patterns and this extreme heat and these storm events in a generally rising climate that are particularly vulnerable for many of our residents who might not have access to air conditioning or don't have great mobility options in their community. And so that's been a lot of the backdrop as we've looked at this policy transformation. And the big bill I said the bill that Bill mentioned, the policy that Bill mentioned is the Future Energy Jobs Act, which many folks in here have worked on and are familiar with. But it's the current piece that's on the books that came on the heels of other legislation over the last decade or so that has really taken what Bill mentioned earlier, which was a centralized system of energy, which is really about the electricity in our buildings primarily, that was generated in one place, moved, and then distributed to buildings. And over time, the legislative structure and the regulatory structure has been changing that. And it's been opening doors to have more solutions that are local. And that essentially ushered in the opportunity for energy efficiency to be a part of what utilities work on in Illinois several years back. It ushered in this investment around smart grid locally. And then from a policy standpoint, it has ushered in this Future Energy Jobs Act. At the same time, you have fundamental changes in the prices of different elements of a distributed system. Renewables have dropped in price. Solar panels have dropped in price. But this most recent bill, the Future Energy Jobs Act, has really opened the door to essentially doubling the spending that goes toward energy efficiency. That means there's more opportunity to capture dollars that can make buildings use less energy, save the operating costs, and reduce the carbon. What I've always appreciated about energy efficiency, and we have to recognize, is it's just not that obvious when it happens. you don't see it. Like you see a solar panel and you can see an electric vehicle. You really don't see the energy efficiency. You don't see that that light bulb is different than the other light bulb, or that this building is really well insulated. It's very tough to see, but it's actually where the biggest number of jobs in the energy space of the clean energy economy lies. So if you look at Illinois, the biggest current on the ground clean energy bucket is actually efficiency in buildings, which is really helpful when you go back to that carbon question and the largest source of emissions coming from buildings, but it's also incredibly helpful when you think about how many buildings there are. There are lots of buildings. They're in every neighborhood. Depending on how the work happens, it's local. Now, some of the materials can be built in different places. I think we have to understand the broader supply chain of where do the light bulbs come from or where do the materials come from. But a lot of that installation work happens in the building. You don't pick up your building, ship it to China, retrofit it, and ship it back. The building's here. And so as we look for opportunities in communities and we look for the transition that needs to happen from a climate standpoint, we need to have the transition happen from a job standpoint. We need to have local wealth creation. And I think that's what is uniquely important as we think about energy efficiency and as we think about the pathways there. So I'm lucky enough to work at an organization that really does a lot of work in energy efficiency, and this policy backdrop is increasing that space in Illinois through FEJA. It's also opening the door to greater spending on renewables. Those are the big prongs, as we know, with specific funding in tranches on workforce to actually provide training for people to move into these economies that they haven't been a part of. And there's a lot more work that needs to happen. People are looking at future legislation that can change that. But we are in a place now where those local solutions are being written into regulations in a way that was very different over the past years. And hopefully we can continue to work together to make sure that that translates into more and more jobs that people in rooms like this will have, or have a friend or relative who's been able to capture, and keep some wealth and grow some wealth in all of our neighborhoods.
Thanks, Karen. Just to kind of put an exclamation point on Karen's point about energy efficiency jobs, through this project that we're working on with Karen, funded by the Chicago Community Trust, that also has Elevate Energy and ComEd involved, we looked at what would a 20% reduction in energy use in buildings in Bronzeville mean? Because that's the goal that ComEd has set out for itself in terms of its energy efficiency programs. And a 20% reduction goal over a short period of time supports about 3,000 jobs. Not all in the community, but that's the level of kind of local value creation and economic activity that's created when we invest in buildings to make them smarter and more efficient. And a lot of that stuff is baked into the state legislation. I think Illinois has some of the most advanced policies in the United States. And maybe, Sarah, you can talk a little bit about how you get that, how you strike that balance, who the key stakeholders engaged are, and what might be coming next in energy policy. And then we can get on to Harry to talk specifically about, okay, what does that mean? What are you training people for, and what are they doing, particularly around things like solar?
Cool. Thanks, Bill. And thank you, everybody, for being here. Guess we're going to be on TV, too. That's exciting. And again, I want to also thank you, Karen, for touting the praises of that unsung hero, energy efficiency. It really burns me up. If this was a presentation on how to bring solar energy to your house, it would be standing room only. If this is about energy efficiency, it's going to be crickets. And I really think energy efficiency, especially speaking from the standpoint of a consumer advocacy group, energy efficiency is the unsung hero in all of this. And those are local jobs. But to back up a second, my name is Sarah Moskowitz. I'm the Outreach Director at the Citizens Utility Board, otherwise known as CUB. And CUB was created in the early 80s to represent the interests of utility ratepayers across the state of Illinois. So we are pretty small, but we work on all different levels of utility oversight. We work before the Illinois Commerce Commission, that's the state agency that has to approve delivery rate hikes and other things. We work in Springfield to try to get more consumer-friendly laws passed, but we also have a very robust grassroots community work aspect, and also a free hotline that you can call if you ever have a question or complaint about a utility. So I get the question sometimes, so what is a utility watchdog consumer advocacy group doing here at a clean energy forum? And my first jokey answer is, well, we're here to make sure that none of you enviros do something to really screw up our bills. Because guess who pays for a lot of this stuff? We do, through our bills. But actually, it's pretty fun to be at Cub nowadays because now more than ever, this has already been mentioned, clean energy is affordable energy. And so a lot of people think, oh, well, renewables, they're expensive, right? And the only way for renewables to compete is through state subsidies and whatnot. Well, no, not actually. The conversations now are about to what extent should ratepayers and governments subsidize fossil fuel as a source of energy. And so it's CUB strongly believes that these clean energy policies that we are pioneering here in the state of Illinois are good for consumers, they're good for our bottom line, and they're having a positive impact on those of us who, just little old homeowners who pay our bills every month. Because guess what? That is how most people interact with the utility system. You know, most people aren't thinking about the grid and the energy mix on that grid. People, to the extent that they're thinking about this stuff at all, are just writing a check every month, or not, depending on whether they can afford it. So what's cool about this work is that we are here where the rubber hits the road. All of these highfalutin policy changes that are propelling us into an energy future is manifesting itself in ways that little old ratepayers like us can actually benefit from. So CUB is a proud member of the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition. That was the group that through some very grueling processes helped bring about the Future Energy Jobs Act that passed in late 2016. I like to joke that it was like the only thing that happened in Springfield in 2016. We made it at the end in December. And we're really excited about FEJA. I think that's come through. It not only expands energy efficiency, it fixed the state's renewable energy portfolio, basically freed up funds and created some awesome incentives for developing renewables. So for example, if you have a house and you have been thinking about installing solar panels, now is the time, because you have a federal tax credit in place, you have a state incentive, the state will buy your renewable energy certificates from you, and the price of the solar panels themselves have plummeted. So now is a really good time, thanks to FEJA, in conjunction with the federal tax credit and the changing economies. Also, a big part of FEJA and part of what we're proud of is that it involves this element of making sure that everybody in the state can benefit from these things. I've been in this business for a long time, and I never thought that I would be able to talk to low-income folks about clean energy or about getting solar. But FEJA, Future Energy Jobs Act, created the Solar for All program. Great program. It involves guarantees of savings for people who are income qualified, who want to participate in community solar, or also sets up job training programs, pipelines, whereby people in underrepresented communities and economically disadvantaged communities, environmental justice communities, can actually go through the training, and I know Harry's going to talk a little bit about the training programs, can go through this and get these local jobs right here, helping us go green. And just one other thing, it's really cool how this panel is focusing on what's happening locally, because I think in this year, 2019, you spend a lot of time watching cable news. You see that the federal Clean Power Plan is gone, it's been killed, and it's easy to get pretty depressed about what's going on at the national level. FEJA puts Illinois on track to meet the goals set up by the federal Clean Power Plan. So even though all this stuff is happening at the national level, but that might not really be working for us, we have an opportunity here at the state and local levels to get this stuff done, even if it's not happening at the federal level. And I think that is an extremely hopeful message. And it also, I never want to pass up the opportunity to mention it to folks, because I think what happens at the state level is very important. People get all freaked out about what's happening with the presidential elections and whatnot, but how many of us can actually name who our state senator is and who our state rep is? Those are the folks who are making these decisions that affect what we pay to the utility companies every month, what kinds of efficiency programs are available to us, what kinds of rebates we can get if we install solar panels. That's happening in Springfield. So you should start paying attention to that. The Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition has a website folks can check out. You can always check out CUB's website. We are available to come out and speak to groups. And I just want to mention, I think it's been alluded to, there is an opportunity here in Illinois to build on the progress that was made with FEJA. There are a number of proposed legislation in Springfield right now aimed at increasing our renewables and our efficiency, and I'm not going to get into the pros and cons of the various pieces of legislation, but it's on the table right now, and if you think these kinds of programs are important, you should get in touch with your representatives in Springfield, because we're hoping to even build on this and increase the funding for programs that already exist to help grow the workforce and help us bring clean energy into our homes.
Thanks, Sarah. And I think that particularly underscores your point about the states. Most of the energy policies related to buildings are determined in state houses and city halls around the United States, not in Washington. And I think certainly FEJA, the smart grid legislation before it, is really an example of how local leaders, stakeholders, utilities can work together to really create something that's pretty interesting. And we'll turn real quick to Harry, because the combination of those two pieces of legislation, the smart meter bill that upgraded the electrical grid and brought smart meters to everybody, as well as FEJA, really transformed the energy system in Illinois. Illinois now, right behind California, has the second smartest electric grid in the United States. That's how modern our infrastructure is, and has one of the most comprehensive solar and efficiency programs. Right. And maybe you could talk a little bit about two things. First, how much was that fundamental transformation and improvement of the electrical grid important to making it us able to put a bunch of solar all over the place? And then what has that meant for your members? How are you training them? What new jobs and skills are being created, and what do you see as the upside opportunity?
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Harry Odie. Can you hear me? All right. No? I'm sorry. Can you hear me now? All right. So I'm with Illinois IBEW Renewable Energy Fund. And back when the FEJA was enacted, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of where we're at right now, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
We were awarded money for training, for solar training. Okay? And the solar training is basically going to involve with installers. A lot of these corporations coming into the state of Illinois, the developers, they're coming from the out of state. And some of them believe that they can bring their own installers with them. And these jobs here belong in Illinois. They don't belong people coming in on a bus and taking over and, what have you. So there needs to be this training aspect, and that's what we're doing. So we've gotten funds to help out on basically 4 components. And the components are, and it basically is junior high, starting at the junior high level, bringing our bus or truck around there, trying to lay the groundwork for the students for a future. Solar's not going away, by the way. It's staying. And these jobs are secure, and they're going to be there forever. And with that, we want to build them into a high school. So right now we have 6 high schools throughout the state that have been slated for, let's bring back the trade into the high school. 2 of them are in Chicago. One's at Prosser. High School on the northwest side. The other one is at Juarez High School. And both of these classes are winded down for their year-long training. And the hopes is that these high school students will transition into our pre-apprentice program, IBEW 134. Next year, we'll tackle 2 more high schools. They have not been chosen yet, but that's the pathway in which we're going, is to bring the high schools, the training back into the high schools. The next one is going to be community colleges. There's 6 of them throughout the state. I've done 2 cohorts at Olive Harvey. And the object here is to basically teach the student, and this is through the People's Recovery. It's a community group on the southeast side of Chicago, Elkhart Gardens, and basically what we're trying to do is trying to get the people into our pre-apprenticeship program. So what we'll do with them is we pay them a stipend to come to class. We will also teach them OSHA, first aid, solar, but more importantly, math. Basic math. Basic math is so important. So we might be spending time with people on the math here. So I've got my second cohort going with that, and then I'm working down in Springfield, Illinois with Lincoln Land Community College to work on with that. You know, I want to go back. I forgot about the high school. One other high school we have is Southeast High School. It's in Springfield, Illinois. And then we have 17 IBEW apprenticeship programs throughout the state of Illinois, from the top to the bottom. And we've developed curriculum. We've had trainers. We've had people ready to rock and roll. And then we deal with also low-income community groups, such as PLCCA, SAFER, YWCA, SCR, and PCR. And these are some of the classes are taught right in this very gym right here. We're going to be starting another cohort with the YWCA and also the SCR. And we've reached out to these community groups, and we'll be starting, I think, a class of 10 females from YWCA, and I think there's like 8 males coming in from SCR. So the hope here is to promote solar training within the state, get these people out into some sort of an apprenticeship program, such as IBEW 134. Because you know what? These are not jobs. These are careers. And we need to make sure people are prepared for careers. And that's the basic concept of what we do. There's a lot more we can talk about, like right here, if you like. It's been a lot of fun. It has been a lot of fun. A lot of trainers that we've had, so we can get qualified people to go out and do training. I've done high school trainers coming up in July here in Chicago, so they can go back to their high schools and train. So basically, that's pretty much what we got going there.
Great. In fact, maybe we can use the success, particularly the success you just described and that Sarah described about the Future Energy Jobs Act and the Smart Grid bill, to talk about a couple other systems that are in transition. And since I know we're going to follow this up with the memo to the mayor, I think you could have some good discussion about other systems that probably could be transformed. Right. And then I want to end it up with a discussion, particularly since you talked about training, about the role of STEM, because I think one of the really interesting and exciting things here in Bronzeville is how much emphasis that the community and ComEd and the schools are putting into STEM education and what that means for the future workforce. So first, let's talk about, and this is for anybody who wants to answer, let's talk about mobility, and then let's talk about water. On mobility, there's a significant push for not just more transit, but more electrification of transportation. And I want to talk a little bit about what we see on the horizon in terms of state policies and what that would mean for organizations like IBEW if suddenly there's a whole bunch of new energy demand for clean energy in transportation. And then the second thing I want to ask for in water, you could look at the city, and this is not Chicago alone, but you could look at the city of Chicago's water and wastewater utility, kind of the same way you look at an energy utility. And you could look into the future and see ComEd or Peoples Gas, which are a much more advanced system. You could look at the city of Chicago's water and wastewater system and see a system that's stuck in the past in the way it's got regressive rate structures, leaking basements, lead pipe problems, combined sewer overflows. And I'm kind of interested in what thoughts are in terms of transformation, and are there good ideas in energy policy that would apply to water policy for the new mayor? So let's start with electrification of transportation.
Okay, so with electrification throughout the state,
The more the better, from my
the
perspective.
more the merrier, right?
I'm assuming that
You know,
that's
it's
your
been
perspective
the
as well.
mandated amount of solar, renewable energy that has to be in place. And, you know, and that's a good thing. It's going to create a lot of jobs throughout the whole state. And then on top of that, we've got the electrification. We have a better environment, first of all. We start going into renewable energy. That's the way we kind of think here. And those are the things that IBEW is trying to push, and legislation as well.
Thanks. Sarah?
Yeah, I would just like to say a couple of things about the electrification of transportation and electric vehicles overall. First, there is legislation in Springfield right now that is aimed at making electric vehicles more accessible and electrified transportation more widespread in the state. CUB, of course, is concerned about, well, if suddenly everybody's car is an electric car and we're all plugging in those electric cars all at once, what's going to happen to the electric system and the electric rates? And we actually have an economist on staff who ran the numbers, and we found that if we do electric vehicles right, it can actually lead to lower prices in the electric market. And so that doesn't make much sense, right? But think about it like this. So the way our electric system is right now is we can't store power on the scale that we would really need to. So all of this electricity powering everything around you right now was created at this instant. So what we have now, which is a problem, is this peak and trough in electric usage that happens every day and every year. And those peaks and troughs get expensive for us because we have to build new power plants in the state that basically sit idle all year and only turn on for a few hours every summer on a hot summer afternoon when everybody's running all their air conditioning all at once. And that's when they have to turn on that power plant. And guess what that power plant uses to make electricity? It uses natural gas usually. So there's another problem there. And then when we have a big drop-off in demand for energy, we have problems then too, because then you have things like wind on the system that are creating a glut of electricity. So you have these problems with the load shape, as they call it, for our electrical system that leads to expense for us. And in theory, if we all had an electric car and we were plugging it in late at night when the actual demand for electricity traditionally plummets, we can charge our car for cheaper because the real-time rate for electricity at those times is really inexpensive, and we can help flatten out that demand curve. So it's a really exciting time right now because we're starting to see electric vehicle adoption take off. There's legislation being discussed in the state right now that would provide incentives, maybe a rebate for folks who install a charging station, either at their business or at their home. And then we are hoping to explore some opportunities to offer people who own an electric vehicle incentives for charging those vehicles at off-peak times. So stay tuned for that. It's going to be kind of fun. And I don't know if we're taking questions yet, but
We're going to talk about water real quick, and then we'll jump into questions.
Water's fun too.
Yeah. So lots of innovation at the state level. Let's take the city of Chicago. What should the city of Chicago be doing about water and wastewater to come into the
I think so. One of the things that has come from the transition committee is, and in particular, impact the communities. The first thing is to make sure. I don't think people are that aware that there are a lot of people who do not have water in their homes. So the recommendation has been to make sure that Chicagoans have access to water. That those who have been shut off of water because they cannot pay for their water bill have access to water. And then looking at a progressive way to look at the rates in which people are able to pay. Water is an essential human necessity. And by cutting people off of water because of their economics is just not something that as a city we can stand on to be proud of. So we can't even talk about stormwater or any other infrastructure possibilities if we're not talking about those who are least, and we're talking about in particular seniors, in particular people who are economically challenged to pay for their water, and not having that stress is a big part of one of the things that we talked about. Another big thing we talked about is to be able to increase the to do a study, because there's a lot of issues around lead, the lead pipe abatement programs. Don't fall down on me. The pesky tripod. So the recommendation is to kind of really do a much better survey of the lead pipes that are leading to the home. So that's also something that is going to be underway that I think that this committee is kind of asked me to look at. In terms of this region in itself, I think it's really important in the next, even though Chicago is declining in terms of population, and almost any climate study that you look at looks at this region, the Great Lakes region, as a region that people will have to move into as climate adversity hit other regions much differently than it will the Great Lakes. And the Great Lakes still provide the largest pool of fresh water in the United States. It's the second biggest pool of fresh water. And then there's talk of us doing and leading in a much more aggressive way around the kind of Great Lakes Alliance across the region where we've been kind of lax. There's talk around, in making sure that there's an easier process so that we comply with some of the stuff that's already in place in terms of stormwater abatement and catchment areas, in terms of that permitting process. So there are things that we could talk ad nauseum about that I think are underway, but I think some of the more important, like 100-day features, even before you get to like all the kind of infrastructure work, is that people in Chicago, Chicagoans, there are some who do not have access to water in and of itself, which is a problem. So before we can jump to anything, it's like folks can't afford to pay for water is an issue. So we've got to come up with a better system that those who are vulnerable in that way can keep their water on, and that is an essential human right.
Yeah, the transformation of what people pay for water and sewer in the city of Chicago is dramatic, and there's no way you can reach a conclusion that is anything other than regressive. And it's got to be addressed.
It's very regressive, and it's also punitive. And if we build a system that continues to be punitive because you don't have the economic prowess to keep up, you don't have a great system.
Yeah.
And so you can't get people to engage in all these other activities to pay for it if they can't get access to the fundamental basic right of water.
For some pretty innovative and exciting ideas. With that, before going to STEM, let's open it up and see if there are any questions. Take it out? Okay. Why don't you come on up, introduce yourself, ask your question, and feel free to do follow-ups. So, anybody? I think there was one. Any questions, comments? Yeah, come on up.
Hey everyone, I'm Jessica Kurzman. I'm an economic development planner at UIC, the Natalie P. Voorhees Center for Community and Neighborhood Development. We've been working at Altgeld Gardens trying to help set up a solar training program there, so probably familiar with some of the folks on staff. My background's actually in environmental policy, and I used to work for a while as an organizer in Detroit on water justice issues. So despite my title, these are issues that are near and dear to my heart. My question is, specifically for Sarah and Anton, but I'd love to hear from everyone else as well on CEJA, on the Clean Energy Jobs Act. I was really excited to see this flyer over there today. When I walked in, we've been following FEJA. We've been trying to understand how that money is actually trickling down to local communities. And I'm curious if folks on the panel can speak about CEJA, and then I particularly would love to hear from you, Anton, about what you think that would look like in order to specifically help democratize it in neighborhoods that have been systematically neglected from the city of Chicago.
Thank you. Thanks for a great question. Thanks for asking about CEJA. CEJA specifically is the piece of the proposed legislation in Springfield right now that the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition supports. And it basically is a bill that builds on the progress that was made with FEJA. So it's kind of like they threw everything, and the kitchen sink into CEJA. Just some highlights include it expands energy efficiency, and it also extends energy efficiency goals to include natural gas as well. Like I mentioned, it looks at electrifying transportation through possible incentives for installing charging stations, coupling vehicle charging with perhaps a time of use rate, which basically provides a cheaper per kilowatt hour rate for consumers, depending on what time of day they're using electricity. It also quadruples the Illinois Solar for All program, and I think that's the really exciting piece. Solar for All is basically a program that makes it easier for people who are income qualified to participate in solar programs, whether it be rooftop or community solar, and also it creates that jobs pipeline I was mentioning. And so part of the criticism of FEJA was it didn't really do enough, and I think we did a lot of work rallying people in diverse communities across the state to support FEJA. But of course, the devil's in the details, and when it comes to actual implementation and when reality sets in, it turns out that, hey, that doesn't go anywhere near far enough. And so that's what we're excited about CEJA is will grow the benefits of those kinds of programs. And then finally, I can't help but mention, this is a wonkier piece, but a piece that's really dear to me as a Cub person. CEJA includes a provision that basically puts the state of Illinois in charge of capacity procurement. Bless you, sorry. I think. That was a sneeze. And that basically the way it works is, so ComEd right now is connected to a regional grid, and that grid operator runs a capacity market, which basically makes sure that there's enough electricity online to meet our needs at those peak times I was talking about. Our problem with this is that the way the grid operator has been running that capacity market, we believe unfairly benefits fossil fuel generators. It props up natural gas capacity, and we're actually over procuring capacity to the tune of, I think, like 21% or something, more than we need. And so that's leading to higher rates. So one piece in CEJA would actually fix that problem by taking that responsibility away from the grid operator and giving it to the state of Illinois so that we have more control over how much we spend on that capacity and what kind of energy generation is added to the mix as a result. And in a very direct way, this will result in lower rates for ratepayers. And I think that is a crucial piece to CEJA, because like all this stuff isn't free, right? And there's always going to be a balance of things, money going into programs and money kind of coming from programs. And CEJA strikes a really nice balance for that. So, and you want to talk a little bit? Somebody else want to mention a little bit?
No, thank you for doing the big backdrop on CEJA. I think one of the things that's been interesting is in the national news, there's a lot of talk of a Green New Deal. And if you look at different states, Illinois actually is coming closest in many ways to looking at what that would mean at a state level. So the backdrop of FIJA and the talk of CJA really is starting to incorporate those broader questions of a fair economy into a clean economy. And so we really have a lot to build on here in Illinois and a lot to pay attention to. What's also interesting is just to build it back to a little bit of this conversation about electric vehicles is I'm willing to bet that everyone in this room has actually been in an electric vehicle because the CTA trains are all electric. And so when we think about this new technology, I want us to remember it's infrastructure that we have to get right so every resident can participate. So I love riding CTA trains, and I love the fact that they're electric. I want to have more CTA buses be electric, and I want us to think in this broad conversation about what's the infrastructure that we put in, what then are the policies that allow private participation, and then what are the jobs that happen at the end, because that's how we're going to come together and actually build the neighborhoods that everyone can thrive in.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much. I think we have been looking at the Green New Deal as a framework to, the devil is in the details in taking policies that exist and then how that implementation really looks. I think that's going to be critical. I think that's going to take more of the kind of voices that are being gathered by people like Paula and others to kind of play a role in directing how that implementation actually happens. Because I agree, the infrastructure is a huge piece that's going to drive once CJA, I think, will pass. I'm being very optimistic. It will come online to kind of propel that. And then looking forward to, like, what, the national dynamics that are changing. I think she mentioned Congressman Rush, who also, was a former staffer there, and their work on that subcommittee, which is probably not, people don't pay attention to it, but is an essential subcommittee that's driving a lot of the energy kind of, in particular around what would happen with the Green New Deal and its new iterations, even with the current president in office. So I think there's a ton of opportunity for there to be more access, this decentralization for people and groups to participate. But I think it's going to take a lot more steadfastness, and people have to really pay attention all the way through the process in order for that to really, because then what ends up happening in business is that it's the speed and the efficiency of trying to make something happen. And, dealing in the community, there's all of these other things you have to be really mindful of. So those kind of clash a bit when you're trying to get something done.
So there was a question about how you would support the legislation.
Call your legislators. Yeah, what can you do to help? Call your legislators and tell them this is important to you.
Paula's group is doing advocacy work on that. So
Yeah.
I would say also, connecting with what Bronzeville group is doing here. They have a network as well, so they also are driving to make sure that we're, have our voices at the state level around what CJA looks like.
Yeah, strangely enough,
we could do a song.
We can harmonize, but strangely, everybody seems to be talking about cannabis legalization and progressive income tax and other kind of not important at all things. Just kidding. We want to make sure that these issues stay front and foremost because we don't want to let the opportunity pass. So please just call the governor, call your state reps and your state senators, and look into local groups that are working in this space. The Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition includes hundreds of state, national, and local organizations. They have a mailing list. We're doing events all over the city this summer to tell people about these issues and get them riled up.
Great.
Thanks for the good setup question.
Thanks. Yeah, there you go. Are there any other questions? If come on up.
Hello, I'm Sharon Riley. I'm Executive Vice President of the Black Data Processing Associates. We're a non-for-profit and we're a STEM group, and we are operating a cohort, which I would love you to speak at, Bill, at the Roosevelt University. But I have several questions, and so just basically for each one of you, it's in terms of you partnering with other groups. So case in point, autonomous vehicles, there's the software does not identify African Americans. So basically, the joke is that it has trouble, so don't go out at night. So they are aware of that software issue, but I don't know if you're working with Google or Facebook or anything like that. So it's just something to think about. And then for water bill, it's tied into your property tax. So when the property taxes came out with the sewer and trash added on, then you had like 2 weeks or a month to get a rebate, which most people didn't know about. The rebate ran between $50 to $250. So if they let that go, that's when the city got that added, like $1 million or so, that, you know, was because people did not know to go and get the rebate. So my question would be, what happened to that money, and is there a way we could get that one back? Because it was basically because people weren't aware. It was called like the Cook County property tax, but it was basically the people in the suburbs couldn't get it, just Cook County. The other one is in terms of there's a young lady I know, and she is really interested in engineering, but since she's at a CPS high school, then she is, this particular high school makes them apply for colleges. And so if she doesn't apply for certain colleges, even though she has an apprenticeship lined up post-graduation, then she's penalized. So it's a lot, you know, moving pieces. And then a lot of my background came in through this Chicago Center for Green Technology, which is where I started to get into the green movement. But again, that was a really wonderful program, and you had workshops that anyone could attend, so you didn't necessarily have to push it through. And then there's another group that I'm familiar with, which is Empower Illinois, and Illinois right now is the only state that has a tax credit from K through 12 where parents can actually get their children into STEM technology. So just wondering if you're working with smart cities, IoT, 1871, any of those to help push, the programs that we need established. So.
Yeah, just real quick on the smart stuff. I think, again, one of the really differentiators in Bronzeville, it is very focused on the work that ComEd is doing on Community of the Future, is very much around, with the community, is around the application of technology and how that technology is enabled by the smart grid, and a lot of it is tied to STEM education, and it really is unique. It's unique in both the approach of leveraging infrastructure like the smart grid, but it's also really unique in the fact that it focuses on people and community and issues before it focuses on technology. And technology is just something which I think, hopefully, that's what you found at the Center for Green Technology. The idea was, let's solve problems, let's provide services, and if technology helps, great. Anybody else have any additional ones? And then let's close on a discussion of STEM real quick. Yeah. Because I know you guys got to go.
Yeah,
They got to go.
Over the time, so.
You know what, everybody, we really appreciate it. Let's give our speakers a round of applause.
Bill, thank you so much. We had a lively discussion. So, as we said, I know Sarah was saying we need to see more people engaged in these conversations, and so I'd like to not only thank Bill and AECOM for sponsoring this, but we said we want to have a way to hold people in and start working on this memo to the mayor. So they have sponsored us a lunch today. So what we'd like to do is to have everyone grab a salad box. We're being green. And those that have to leave, we really thank you. Please grab one for yourself as well. So we're going to continue our on-the-table discussion for our next hour. We've got some people here that can help us. I know Sarah's got time to help us work with folks at a table. Got another one of our colleagues, Bo Rhoda, who's been supporting us on how to get these smart cities thinking and planning done. So I'm going to ask him to join at one of the tables. And so the assignment for the memo to the mayor is a lot of what you heard that really resonated as a priority. We covered a gamut. And I did want to, first of all, thank the staff from the Bronzeville Community Development Partnership that is here and is always working and helping. I always fail to do that. So I'd like to acknowledge their efforts, and if you would give them a round of applause for being here. I had just one announcement that really dealt with what we're dealing with today about the electric vehicles. And so many know that Bronzeville Community Development Partnership was a part of a pilot called the Last Mile Mobility with ComEd. And we completed that pilot on the electric vehicle, and it was something that really aligned with our interest in something you've heard for a while called Jitney Driver. And so the Jitney Driver program became Jitney Driver EV. And so ComEd said, well, we're doing some pilot on electric vehicles. You guys can learn more about how electric vehicles work, charging, some of the things that we talked about today. So as another on the table this evening, we are going to be a part of a pitch about urban mobility down at 1871 at the Connectory with Bosch. And we are going to do our pitch deck for Jitney Driver EV, and that is a hyper-local transportation system that we intend to bring to Bronzeville and support our vision of having a sustainable tourism destination. So wish our team luck, and we will have more to report on that. But that concludes our presentation. I want to thank you all for being here and being so attentive and having good questions. So please grab your lunch. Let's work on at least some aspects of this memo to the mayor. And if Bo and Sarah can help us, let's take advantage of these tables and a great lunch. Have a good day. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Paula.
Thank you.